Anger usually doesn't arrive loudly at first. It begins quietly, almost politely, as a tightening in the chest, a faster breath, a subtle urge to defend something inside us. Most people believe anger is an explosion, but in reality it is a slow internal negotiation that goes wrong. It forms when expectations collide with reality, when the world refuses to cooperate with the story we believe should be true. At its core, anger is not about what others do. It is about what we believe they should have done, and the emotional debt we think they owe us for failing to meet that belief. What makes anger so dangerous is how convincing it feels. In the moment, it seems justified, even necessary. It tells us that we are standing up for ourselves, protecting our dignity, correcting injustice. But beneath that surface story, anger is usually masking something more fragile. It often hides fear of being disrespected, fear of losing control, fear of being insignificant, or fear of being wrong. Anger feels strong, but it is powered by vulnerability that has not been acknowledged. The mind plays a clever trick here. It frames anger as a reaction to external events, as if other people are pressing a button inside us. But that button does not exist. What exists instead is interpretation. Two people can experience the same event and feel entirely different emotions. One becomes furious, the other shrugs and moves on. The difference is not the event itself, but the meaning assigned to it. The moment we realize this, anger begins to lose its authority. Most anger comes from the illusion of control. We walk through life carrying invisible rules about how people should behave, how fast things should happen, how fair the world should be. When reality violates those rules, the mind treats it as a threat. Anger emerges as an attempt to reassert control over an uncontrollable world. But this attempt is always doomed, because control over others is never truly available. The more we demand it, the more frustrated we become. There is also a deep misunderstanding about what anger accomplishes. Many people believe anger motivates action or earns respect. In truth, anger usually narrows thinking, reduces emotional intelligence, and pushes people away. It may create short-term compliance through fear, but it destroys trust and clarity. Internally, it floods the body with stress hormones, keeping the nervous system in a constant state of alert. Over time, this wears down health, relationships, and judgment. Anger promises strength but delivers exhaustion. Another reason anger persists is because it becomes familiar. For some, it has been rehearsed for years. The mind learns that anger feels energizing compared to sadness or fear. It feels like movement instead of helplessness. But familiarity should not be confused with usefulness. Just because an emotional pattern is practiced does not mean it serves us. It only means the brain has learned the shortcut. A crucial shift happens when we stop asking, "Who caused this?" and start asking, "What belief made this hurt?" Almost every angry reaction can be traced back to a hidden assumption. Someone should respect me. Things should go my way if I try hard enough. People should know better. Life should be fair. These assumptions operate silently, and when they are violated, anger steps in as the enforcer. But assumptions are not laws of reality. They are preferences masquerading as truths. When we examine these beliefs calmly, many of them collapse. People are inconsistent. Life is unpredictable. Effort does not guarantee outcome. Respect cannot be forced. Once these realities are accepted, anger loses much of its fuel. Acceptance here does not mean approval. It means understanding what is and responding intelligently rather than emotionally. There is also an important distinction between anger and clarity. Calm awareness can recognize injustice, set boundaries, and take firm action without emotional aggression. In fact, calm responses are often more effective because they are strategic rather than reactive. Anger rushes toward expression. Clarity pauses to choose. The strongest people are not those who feel anger most intensely, but those who can observe it without being ruled by it. One of the most powerful tools against anger is time, but not in the passive sense of cooling off. Time allows the emotional surge to pass so reasoning can return. Anger demands immediate action because it fears reflection. If it can, language also plays a critical role. The way we talk to ourselves during triggering moments determines whether anger escalates or dissolves. When the inner voice says, "This is unacceptable," or "I can't believe this," it sharpens the emotional blade. When it says, "This is unpleasant, but I can handle it," the nervous system responds differently. The event remains the same, but the emotional trajectory changes. Another overlooked element is identity. People often fuse anger with their sense of self. They see themselves as someone who is passionate, fiery, or not to be crossed. Letting go of anger can feel like losing strength or self-respect. But real self-respect comes from self-mastery. The ability to remain composed under pressure is not weakness. It is evidence of inner authority. Anger also thrives on personalization. We assume negative events are deliberate, targeted, and intentional. Most of the time, they are not. People are distracted, stressed, insecure, or acting from their own internal narratives. When we stop assuming malicious intent, emotional intensity drops. Not because behavior becomes acceptable, but because it becomes understandable. Perhaps the most liberating realization is that anger is optional. Not in the sense that it never arises, but in the sense that it does not have to be obeyed. Emotions are signals, not commands. Anger can inform us that a boundary exists, that a value matters, or that something requires attention. But it does not dictate how we respond. The moment we see anger as information rather than instruction, we regain freedom. As this understanding deepens, a quieter confidence begins to replace emotional volatility. Situations that once triggered immediate reactions now create space for choice. The world does not become easier, but the internal experience becomes lighter. And once that shift begins, a deeper question naturally emerges. If anger is not required for strength or self-protection, what actually creates lasting inner stability and influence? That is where the next layer of understanding quietly begins to unfold. There comes a point where simply understanding anger is no longer enough. Insight explains why it happens, but it does not automatically stop it from arising. The deeper work begins when we turn attention toward the internal conditions that allow anger to take root in the first place. This is where emotional responsibility quietly replaces emotional reactivity. Instead of trying to manage the world so we don't get angry, we begin managing the inner terrain that interprets the world. At the center of this terrain is expectation. Expectations are not inherently harmful, but unconscious expectations are. When we expect people to behave according to our internal standards without ever acknowledging those standards, disappointment is inevitable. Anger often follows disappointment like a shadow. The mind says, they should have known, but the truth is they could not know what was never clearly expressed or what only exists in our private rules about how life should unfold. One of the most stabilizing shifts a person can make is to replace expectations with preferences. A preference allows flexibility. An expectation demands compliance. When a preference is unmet, there is information. When an expectation is unmet, there is offense. This subtle change in framing dramatically alters emotional outcomes. Life stops feeling like a series of personal violations and starts feeling like a complex system that occasionally aligns and occasionally does not. Another quiet source of anger is the need to be right. Being right feels safe. It gives the ego something solid to stand on. But the emotional cost of always needing to be right is high. It turns every disagreement into a threat and every differing perspective into a challenge. Anger rushes in to defend identity, not truth. When the need to be right softens, curiosity replaces combat. Conversations become explorations rather than battlegrounds. Control is another illusion that feeds anger. The mind prefers certainty, even if that certainty is negative. Uncertainty feels dangerous because it offers no clear plan of action. Anger gives the illusion of direction. It says, at least I know how I feel. But clinging to control in an uncontrollable world creates constant friction. The calmer alternative is influence rather than control. Influence accepts limits and works within them. Control denies limits and resents their existence. A useful way to weaken anger is to study it as a physical experience rather than a personal narrative. In the body, anger is sensation, heat, tension, pressure, acceleration. When attention stays with these sensations without feeding the story behind them, the emotion often dissolves on it. This observation reveals something surprising. Anger is uncomfortable, but it is not unbearable. It feels urgent, but it is temporary. The belief that anger must be expressed or acted upon to go away is false. Often, expression prolongs it. Silence, not suppression but conscious restraint, allows it to pass. This is not about bottling emotions. It is about not letting them hijack behavior. Another layer of anger comes from unresolved past experiences. Old wounds look for familiar patterns. When something in the present resembles an earlier injury, even faintly, the emotional response is amplified. The reaction seems disproportionate because it is not just about now. Awareness of this dynamic creates space for compassion toward oneself. The anger is not a flaw. It is a signal pointing to something unfinished. Responsibility plays a key role here. Not responsibility as blame, but responsibility as ownership. When we say, they made me angry, we give power away. When we say, I interpreted this in a way that created anger, power returns. Ownership does not excuse others' behavior. It simply places emotional authority back where it belongs. With that authority comes choice. Boundaries are often misunderstood as aggressive lines drawn through anger. In reality, the clearest boundaries are calm and firm. They do not require emotional charge to be effective. Anger often appears when boundaries are weak or inconsistent. The emotion tries to compensate for a lack of clarity. When boundaries are clearly defined and calmly enforced, anger has less work to do. There is also the matter of self-talk. The internal dialogue during challenging moments determines emotional outcomes more than external events. A harsh inner voice creates an equally harsh emotional climate. When the mind speaks in absolutes, anger thrives. Words like always, never, unacceptable, and intolerable narrow perception and intensify feeling. Softer language widens perception and reduces emotional pressure. Forgiveness often enters this conversation, but it is frequently misunderstood. Forgiveness is not approval, nor is it forgetting. It is the decision to stop carrying emotional debt for something that cannot be changed. Holding on to anger in the name of justice often punishes the holder more than the offender. Letting go is not weakness. It is conservation of energy. As emotional awareness deepens, something unexpected happens. The need to react diminishes. Situations that once triggered immediate anger now feel manageable. Not because they no longer matter, but because the internal system handling them has matured. There is a growing trust in one's ability to respond intelligently without emotional force. This maturity brings a new kind of strength. It is quiet, unprovable, and deeply stable. It does not announce itself. It shows up as patience, clarity, and presence. Others may feel it without being able to name it. Conflicts escalate faster. Decisions improve. Relationships become less dramatic and more honest. Yet even with all this understanding, moments of anger will still arise. The goal is not perfection. It is progress. Each time anger is noticed earlier, questioned faster, and released sooner, the pattern weakens. Over time, what once felt automatic becomes optional. And as anger loosens its grip, a more subtle challenge appears. Without anger as a familiar response, what fills the space it leaves behind? How does one navigate injustice, disrespect, or loss without emotional fire? The answer does not come immediately. It emerges slowly, through a different kind of inner strength that is less reactive and far more enduring. That exploration is where the journey naturally turns next. When anger no longer dominates the inner landscape, a quieter emotional space opens up, and at first it can feel unfamiliar. Many people mistake this calm for passivity or indifference, but it is neither. What replaces anger is not weakness, but discernment. This is where emotional maturity begins to show itself, not in dramatic restraint, but in the ability to respond without internal turbulence. The absence of anger does not remove intensity from life. It removes distortion. One of the first things that becomes clearer in this space is the difference between pain and suffering. Pain is inevitable. Disappointment, loss, betrayal, and frustration are part of being human. Suffering, however, is the mental resistance layered on top of pain. Anger is one of the most common forms of that resistance. It argues with reality. This clarity allows emotions to be felt fully without being acted out. Sadness can be present without collapsing into despair. Fear can be acknowledged without turning into aggression. Even frustration can exist without becoming hostility. Emotions stop competing for control and start functioning as information. They point inward rather than outward. They ask for understanding rather than expression. A significant shift happens in how conflicts are perceived. Without anger clouding perception, conflicts are no longer seen as battles to be won, but as situations to be navigated. The goal quietly changes from victory to resolution. Listening becomes easier because the ego is no longer on constant defense. There is less need to interrupt, justify, or dominate. Silence becomes a tool rather than a threat. This does not mean tolerating mistreatment. On the contrary, calm awareness often leads to firmer boundaries. When anger is absent, boundaries become clearer and more consistent. They are no longer reactions to emotional overload, but deliberate decisions based on self-respect. People may even take these boundaries more seriously, because they are delivered without emotional chaos. Another important transformation occurs in decision-making. Anger compresses time. It demands immediate action and punishes hesitation. Calm expands time. It allows consequences to be considered. Long-term outcomes begin to matter more than short-term emotional relief. This shift alone changes the trajectory of many lives. Fewer impulsive words are spoken. Fewer irreversible actions are taken. Regret loses much of its power. Relationships also begin to change, often subtly at first. When anger is no longer a default response, conversations soften. Even difficult topics feel less threatening. Others may initially be confused by the change, especially if they are accustomed to emotional intensity. Over time, however, trust grows. Predictability replaces volatility. Emotional safety becomes possible. There is also a deeper internal relationship that improves. The relationship with oneself. Anger often includes self-directed hostility, even when it appears outwardly focused. Her self-judgment, unrealistic standards, and constant inner pressure fuel external reactions. As anger dissolves, self talk becomes more humane. Mistakes are still noticed, but they are met with correction rather than punishment. Growth accelerates in an environment that is firm but kind. Patience emerges naturally in this state, not as forced tolerance, but as understanding of process. People act from their level of awareness. Situations unfold in their own time. Not everything is personal. This understanding does not make someone naive. It makes them efficient. Energy is no longer wasted on emotional battles that lead nowhere. One of the most surprising developments is how influence increases as anger decreases. Calm presence has weight. People listen more carefully when they do not feel attacked. Authority no longer needs volume. Confidence no longer needs force. The ability to remain steady in emotionally charged situations often commands more respect than emotional dominance ever did. There is also a noticeable change in how mistakes are handled, both one's own and others. Anger tends to freeze people in their errors, replaying them endlessly. Calm awareness treats mistakes as feedback. What went wrong? What can be adjusted? This practical orientation turns problems into information rather than identity. Shame fades. Learning accelerates. As life continues, challenges do not disappear. Loss still hurts. Injustice still exists. Unfairness still stings. The difference is in how these experiences are metabolized. Without anger as a filter, reality is processed more directly. Grief is allowed to be grief. Disappointment is allowed to be disappointment. These emotions complete their cycle instead of getting stuck in resentment. Over time, something like emotional confidence develops. Not confidence that nothing will hurt, but confidence that whatever arises can be handled without self-betrayal. This confidence is quiet and deeply stabilizing. It reduces the need for external validation because internal alignment becomes more important than winning approval or arguments. Eventually, attention turns toward a deeper question. If anger is no longer the driving force, what guides action? The answer is not passivity. It is values. When reactions soften, values become clearer. Decisions start aligning with principles rather than impulses. Integrity replaces intensity as the primary motivator. Life becomes less reactive and more intentional. This is where emotional freedom begins to feel real. Not freedom from feeling, but freedom within feeling. The inner world becomes less crowded. At this stage, the work is no longer about stopping anger. That battle has mostly been won. The work becomes about cultivating something deeper and more sustaining. A steady inner compass that does not depend on emotional extremes. A way of moving through the world that is firm, calm, and quietly powerful. And that naturally raises the next question. Once anger no longer drives behavior, what becomes the true source of motivation, resilience, and purpose? The answer lies beyond emotional control, in a deeper understanding of meaning and self-direction, where calm is not just an absence of anger, but the presence of something far more enduring. When anger is no longer the engine driving behavior, motivation begins to come from a different place. It no longer rises out of emotional pressure, but from inner alignment. This kind of motivation is quieter, but far more sustainable. It does not need conflict to feel alive. It moves forward because it knows where it is going. The energy once spent reacting is now available for building, refining, and choosing with intention. At this stage, resilience starts to look different. It is no longer about toughness or endurance in the traditional sense. It is about flexibility, the ability to bend without breaking, the capacity to adapt without losing one's core. Anger tends to harden people. Calm awareness softens without weakening. This softness allows life to be met as it is, not as it should be, which paradoxically makes a person harder to destabilize. Meaning also becomes clearer when emotional noise fades. Anger often creates false purpose. It gives a temporary sense of direction by opposing something. Fighting, resisting, proving, correcting. When anger subsides, those oppositional goals lose their pull. What remains is a more intrinsic sense of meaning, rooted in values rather than reactions. Life begins to feel guided rather than pushed. Values are quiet, but they are persistent. They do not demand immediate expression. They wait patiently for the right moment. When decisions are made from values instead of emotion, consistency increases. There is less internal conflict because actions align with what genuinely matters, not with what feels urgent in the moment. This alignment creates a deep sense of self-trust. With self-trust comes a different relationship to uncertainty. Anger thrives on certainty. It wants clear villains and clear victories. Calm purpose can tolerate ambiguity. It understands that not everything needs to be resolved immediately. Some things need to unfold. This tolerance reduces anxiety and creates space for creativity. New solutions appear where rigid thinking once dominated. There is also a shift in how responsibility is experienced. Without anger, responsibility no longer feels like a burden or a threat. It feels like authorship. Life is no longer something that happens to you. It is something you participate in. This sense of authorship does not mean controlling outcomes, but choosing responses. It is the difference between reacting to circumstances and shaping direction within them. Relationships deepen further in this phase. Without anger distorting perception, people are seen more clearly. Not idealized, not demonized, but understood. Compassion grows naturally, not as a moral obligation, but as a recognition of shared human limitations. This does not erase boundaries. It refines them. Boundaries become less defensive and more intentional. Communication changes in noticeable ways. Words are chosen more carefully, not to avoid conflict, but to be precise. Tone becomes an instrument rather than a weapon. Silence becomes meaningful rather than awkward. The need to convince others diminishes. Influence flows from presence rather than persuasion. There is also a new relationship with failure. Without anger, failure loses its emotional sting. It still matters, but it no longer defines. Mistakes are integrated rather than resisted. This integration accelerates growth. Learning becomes continuous because there is no emotional penalty for being wrong. Curiosity replaces defensiveness. Over time, a sense of inner stability develops that does not depend on circumstances. Good days are appreciated. Bad days are navigated. Neither defines identity. This stability creates emotional independence. External validation becomes pleasant but unnecessary. Criticism becomes information rather than injury. At this point, many people notice a subtle shift in how time is experienced. Anger compresses time into urgent moments. This internal spaciousness allows deeper reflection. Questions arise that are no longer about reaction, but about direction. What is worth building? What deserves energy? What can be let go without loss? These questions are not dramatic. They are practical, and answering them gradually reshapes daily life. The absence of anger also brings a new kind of courage. Not the courage to confront, but the courage to remain open. To stay present in uncomfortable conversations, to face uncertainty without armoring up emotionally, to act from conviction rather than impulse. This courage is quieter, but it lasts. Eventually, calm becomes more than an emotional state. It becomes a way of being, a baseline from which action arises. This calm does not eliminate passion or intensity. It channels them. Energy is no longer scattered across reactions. It is focused, deliberate, and aligned. And yet, one final challenge remains. Even with calm purpose and inner stability, life will present moments of deep provocation. Situations that test patience, values, and resolve at once. The question then becomes not how to avoid anger, but how to remain rooted when everything pulls toward reaction. That final integration, where calm holds under real pressure, is where the understanding reaches its deepest expression. There is a moment in every long inner transformation where theory gives way to real pressure. Not everyday irritation, but the kind of situation that strikes at identity, security, or loss. This is where everything learned about anger is tested, not in comfort, but in strain. The goal here is no longer to eliminate emotional reaction entirely. It is to remain rooted while emotions move through. Calm, at this depth, is not the absence of disturbance. It is stability within it. When pressure rises, the nervous system reacts before the mind has time to interpret. Heart rate changes. Muscles tighten. Old emotional patterns try to reassert themselves. This is not failure. It is biology. The difference now is awareness. Instead of being pulled into the reaction, there is recognition. Something is happening inside me. That single recognition creates space. Space breaks automaticity. In that space, choice lives. Staying rooted under pressure depends less on thought and more on presence. When the mind tries to reason its way out of emotional intensity, it often escalates it. Presence works differently. It grounds attention in what is happening now, not in imagined outcomes or remembered injuries. Breathing slows. Sensation is noticed. The body is allowed to settle before decisions are made. This is not avoidance. It is preparation. One of the most important skills at this level is restraint without suppression. Suppression pushes emotion down and stores it. Restraint allows emotion to exist without being expressed destructively. This requires trust. Trust that feelings can rise and fall without immediate action. Trust that silence will not equal loss of power. Trust that not reacting does not mean agreeing or giving in. In high pressure moments, values become anchors. When emotion pulls in one direction, values pull in another. The question quietly shifts from, how do I feel, to, who do I choose to be here? This question bypasses emotional urgency and activates integrity. Integrity does not argue with emotion. It simply outlasts it. Another stabilizing factor is perspective. Under pressure, the mind narrows. Everything feels immediate and absolute. Reintroducing perspective widens the frame. Will this matter in a week? A year? Does this align with the life I am building, or just with the feeling of this moment? Perspective does not minimize pain. It contextualizes it. It also becomes clear that some situations require action, not emotional processing. Calm does not mean passive endurance. It means acting without inner chaos. Firm decisions can be made. Consequences can be accepted. Relationships can be ended. Boundaries can be enforced. The difference is that these actions are clean. They do not carry the residue of resentment. There is a particular freedom that appears when anger no longer dictates behavior under pressure. The fear of losing control diminishes because control is no longer equated with emotional force. Self-respect becomes internal rather than performative. Dignity does not need to be defended loudly. It is maintained quietly. At this depth, compassion expands further, including toward those who provoke, not because their behavior is justified, but because their limitations are seen clear. Even grief and injustice are metabolized differently here. They are allowed to hurt without turning into bitterness. Mourning replaces resentment. Resolve replaces rage. There is space to act meaningfully rather than react emotionally. Energy moves toward repair, protection, or withdrawal, depending on what aligns with values. Over time, a profound internal reliability develops. No matter what happens, there is trust in one's ability to remain present, choose deliberately, and recover quickly. Emotional storms may still pass through, but they no longer leave lasting damage. The inner foundation holds. This reliability changes how life is approached. Risks feel more manageable. Conversations feel less threatening. Uncertainty feels navigable. There is less need to control outcomes because there is confidence in response. This confidence is quiet and deeply personal. It does not seek recognition. Eventually, anger becomes a rare visitor rather than a frequent companion. When it appears, it is noticed early and understood quickly. It no longer defines moments or decisions. It passes like weather rather than shaping climate. What remains is not emotional flatness, but emotional depth. Feelings are experienced more fully because they are not resisted or dramatized. Life feels more real, not less intense. There is a grounded engagement with reality that does not depend on extremes. At the end of this journey, something simple becomes clear. Anger was never the source of strength it claimed to be. Strength came from awareness, choice, and alignment. Calm was not a loss of power, but its refinement. And with that realization, the inner work reaches a quiet conclusion. Not because life becomes easy, but because the relationship with difficulty has fundamentally changed. The storm no longer owns the sky. By the time anger no longer governs reactions, something subtle but profound has settled into place. Life does not feel conquered or resolved, but navigable. There is a sense of being able to meet whatever arrives without abandoning oneself. This final stage is not about mastering emotion, but about living in quiet cooperation with it. Emotional life becomes integrated rather than managed. What becomes most noticeable here is simplicity. Situations that once required intense internal debate now resolve themselves quickly, not because they are easy, but because clarity has replaced confusion. There is less mental noise, fewer inner arguments, and far less justification. Decisions feel cleaner. Even difficult choices carry less emotional residue. This simplicity changes daily life in small but meaningful ways. Conversations are more direct. Reactions are slower, but more accurate. There is less need to replay events mentally, because nothing is left unfinished inside. The mind rests more easily when it is not constantly preparing for emotional defense. Another quiet transformation is humility. Without anger reinforcing identity, the ego softens. Being wrong is no longer threatening. Learning becomes continuous. Other people's perspectives are considered without needing to agree with them. This humility is not self-diminishing. It is self-secure. It does not need to prove itself. Gratitude also emerges more naturally. Not forced appreciation, but a steady recognition of what is working, what is sufficient, what is already present. Anger tends to focus attention on lack and violation. Calm awareness notices balance and possibility. This shift does not ignore problems. It simply prevents them from consuming the entire field of attention. There is also a new relationship with effort. Without emotional urgency driving action, work becomes more focused and less draining. Energy is applied where it matters most. Rest is taken without guilt. Productivity improves not because of pressure, but because resistance has decreased. Social dynamics continue to evolve. Some relationships deepen, others fade. This happens naturally, without drama. When anger leaves, compatibility becomes clearer. There is less tolerance for chronic disrespect, but also less need to control others' behavior. People are allowed to be who they are. Choices are made accordingly. One of the most important outcomes at this stage is inner consistency. Words, actions, and values align more often. This alignment creates a sense of peace that is difficult to explain but easy to feel. Life feels coherent. Even when things are uncertain, there is an underlying steadiness. Challenges still arrive, but they are met with curiosity rather than resistance. What is this asking of me? There is also a deeper acceptance of human limitation. Not everything can be fixed. Not everyone can be reached. Some outcomes are out of reach no matter how much effort is applied. Accepting this does not lead to apathy. It leads to wiser investment of energy. Letting go becomes a skill rather than a failure. As this acceptance settles, life feels less like a struggle and more like a collaboration. Effort and surrender find balance. Action and patience coexist. Control is replaced by participation. This balance reduces exhaustion and increases resilience. At this point, anger has fully lost its central role. It may still appear, briefly and faintly, but it no longer shapes identity or direction. It is simply one emotional signal among many, no more authoritative than fatigue or hunger. What remains is a grounded way of moving through the world. Calm does not announce itself. It is visible in how someone listens, how they pause, how they respond under pressure. It is felt in the absence of unnecessary conflict and the presence of quiet confidence. This way of being does not make life perfect. It makes it honest. Honest about limits. Honest about feelings. Honest about choices. And in that honesty, there is freedom. Not freedom from challenge, but freedom from being internally controlled by it. In the end, never getting angry is not about suppressing a natural emotion. It is about no longer needing it as a guide. Life becomes guided by awareness, values, and presence instead. Anger fades because it has been understood, not because it has been fought. And with that understanding, the journey completes itself. Not with a dramatic conclusion, but with a quiet sense of arrival. A feeling that nothing essential is missing. That whatever comes next can be met fully, calmly, and without losing oneself in the process. There is often a quiet aftermath that follows deep inner change, and it does not look the way people expect. It is not celebratory. It is not dramatic. It feels more like standing in a familiar room after unnecessary noise has finally stopped. Nothing new has been added, yet everything feels different. This is the phase where calm is no longer practiced. It is lived. Daily experiences begin to reveal this shift in subtle ways. A delay does not tighten the body. A disagreement does not spark an inner argument that continues for hours. An insult lands and passes without embedding itself. The mind notices these moments almost with surprise, as if checking whether anger should arrive, and finding that it simply does not. Not because it is forbidden, but because it is no longer useful. At this point, emotional regulation has moved below conscious effort. There is no internal lecture, no reminder to stay calm. The nervous system has learned a new baseline. This is important, because real freedom does not require constant vigilance. What once took effort now takes awareness, and awareness has become natural. One of the deeper changes here is how silence is experienced. Silence no longer feels like tension or suppression. It feels like space. In conversations, there is less rush to fill gaps. Pauses are allowed. Thoughts settle before words form. This creates a different quality of communication. People feel heard, even when little is said. There is also a noticeable reduction in internal storytelling. Events happen, but they are not endlessly narrated and judged. The mind no longer needs to assign blame, extract meaning, or replay scenarios to protect itself. This frees enormous mental energy. Attention returns to the present moment more easily, where life is actually occurring. Without anger driving momentum, some people worry they will lose ambition. The opposite tends to happen. Goals become clearer because they are no longer reactions. Effort becomes more focused because it is not scattered across emotional battles. Discipline becomes easier because it is no longer fueled by self-criticism. Progress feels steadier, less exhausting. There is also a deeper sense of timing. Not everything needs to be addressed immediately. Some things improve with distance. Some resolve themselves. Others clarify with patience. This sense of timing prevents unnecessary confrontation and preserves energy for what truly matters. Another quiet development is forgiveness toward oneself. Without anger as a companion, old regrets lose their emotional charge. Past mistakes are remembered without shame. Lessons remain, but self-punishment fades. This creates psychological safety inside, which encourages honesty and growth. Life also feels less crowded with unnecessary urgency. Fewer things feel like emergencies. This does not lead to laziness. At this stage, emotional intelligence becomes embodied rather than intellectual. Empathy arises naturally, not as a technique, but as perception. You can sense when someone is acting from fear, insecurity, or pain without needing to label it. This understanding does not obligate you to fix them. It simply informs how you engage. There is also a growing comfort with not reacting at all. Some situations do not require a response. This realization alone dissolves countless sources of stress. Silence becomes a form of wisdom rather than avoidance. As life continues, the world does not suddenly become kinder or more reasonable. What changes is the internal filter through which it is experienced. The absence of anger allows reality to be seen more clearly, without distortion. This clarity does not guarantee comfort, but it does provide orientation. In this orientation, meaning is no longer extracted from conflict. It is found in contribution, presence, and alignment. Small acts feel significant. Daily routines feel grounded. There is a sense of participation in life rather than resistance to it. Eventually, the idea of never getting angry no longer feels like a rule or an achievement. It feels irrelevant. Anger is not avoided, it is simply outgrown, like a tool that once served a purpose and is no longer needed. What remains is not emotional emptiness, but emotional sufficiency, a feeling that nothing needs to be added or removed for life to be workable. This sufficiency creates peace, not as a mood, but as a background condition. And in that condition, something becomes clear without needing explanation. The goal was never to control anger. The goal was to understand oneself deeply enough that anger lost its role. Once that understanding is complete, there is nothing left to manage. From here, life continues as it always has, with change, uncertainty, and challenge. The difference is internal. The ground no longer shakes when storms pass through, and that quiet stability, once discovered, does not need to be defended. It simply remains. At this point, what unfolds is less about improvement and more about trust. Trust in one's inner balance. Trust that emotions will rise and fall without taking control. Trust that life does not need constant correction to be lived well. This trust is not blind optimism. It is earned through experience, through seeing again and again that calm responses lead to clearer outcomes. There is a noticeable lightness now in how situations are held. Problems are addressed, but they are not carried everywhere. When something ends, it ends. When something is unresolved, it is allowed to remain unresolved without creating inattention. The mind no longer treats open loops as threats. This reduces background stress that many people assume is normal. Time itself feels different. Moments are not rushed through emotionally. There is more presence in ordinary things. Walking, listening, working, resting. None of these require commentary. Life does not need to be constantly interpreted to be meaningful. Meaning shows up quietly when attention is no longer scattered. Another subtle shift is how comparison fades. Anger often feeds on comparison. Who is ahead? Who is wrong? Who has taken something from us? Without anger, comparison loses its emotional charge. Other people's choices feel less personal. Their success does not diminish your worth. Their failure does not elevate it. Everyone is simply moving through their own path. This neutrality creates fairness in perception. Situations are seen more accurately, without emotional inflation. Small issues remain small. Large issues are taken seriously without becoming overwhelming. This proportional response makes life feel more manageable, even when it is demanding. There is also a deeper patience with growth, both one's own and others. Change is no longer forced. Habits evolve gradually. Conversations unfold over time. Expectations soften. This patience does not mean settling. It means allowing transformation to happen at a human pace. One of the most telling signs of this stage is how quickly balance returns after disruption. A sharp comment, an unexpected loss, a stressful moment still creates a reaction, but recovery is faster. The nervous system resets more easily. There is no prolonged emotional hangover. This resilience is quiet but powerful. Identity also loosens its grip. You are no longer defined by how you react or how others see you. There is a sense of self that exists before reaction. This makes criticism easier to hear and praise easier to accept without attachment. Identity becomes stable enough to remain flexible. With this stability, generosity emerges naturally. Not forced kind, life still presents moral and emotional challenges. Injustice still exists. Loss still hurts. But responses come from grounded conviction rather than emotional volatility. Action is taken where it matters. Acceptance is practiced where action is not possible. This discernment reduces inner conflict. Eventually, the concept of anger itself becomes less central. It is no longer an enemy or a problem to solve. It is simply one possible emotional response among many, rarely chosen because it is rarely the most effective. This neutrality toward anger signals true freedom from it. What remains is a steady engagement with life. Not detached, not overly invested, but present. There is room for joy without clinging, sorrow without collapse, effort without strain. Emotional life becomes fluid rather than rigid. In this state, peace is not something achieved after everything is resolved. It exists alongside uncertainty. It coexists with effort, with ambition, with challenge. It is not dependent on conditions being perfect. And so the journey settles into something very simple. Living without anger does not make life extraordinary. It makes it workable, clear, honest, calm enough to respond, strong enough to endure, and open enough to feel. There is nothing left to add, and nothing left to remove. Only the ongoing experience of meeting life as it comes, without the need to fight it internally. That is not an ending. It is a way of continuing. What follows after all of this is not a new phase to achieve, but a deepening of something already present. Life continues, but the relationship with it has fundamentally shifted. There is no longer a sense of wrestling with experience or trying to stay ahead of it emotionally. Instead, there is a quiet companionship with whatever arises. Events come and go, and the inner ground remains steady beneath them. One of the most striking changes at this point is how little energy is spent on resistance. Situations are still assessed, choices are still made, but there is no internal argument with reality. The mind stops asking why things shouldn't be the way they are and starts asking what can be done with what is. This subtle shift removes a tremendous amount of friction from daily life. Emotional honesty deepens here. Without anger clouding awareness, feelings are recognized early and accurately. Fatigue is noticed before it becomes irritation. Disappointment is acknowledged before it hardens into resentment. This early recognition allows gentle adjustment rather than dramatic correction. Life becomes easier not because it is controlled, but because it is attended to. There is also a sense of internal spaciousness that persists even during difficulty. Problems occupy their proper place rather than consuming the entire mental field. This makes it possible to hold complexity without overwhelm. Multiple truths can exist at once. Something can be painful and acceptable, unfair and survivable, difficult and temporary. Another quiet development is how naturally forgiveness operates now. Not as a conscious decision, but as a byproduct of understanding. When behavior is seen clearly, without personalization, it loses its power to wound deeply. Forgiveness becomes less about releasing others and more about not carrying unnecessary weight. At this level, attention becomes a precious resource. It is given deliberately. Arguments that once demanded engagement are now recognized as distractions. Emotional drama loses its pull. There is an increasing preference for depth over noise, for substance over stimulation. This preference reshapes priorities. Time is spent differently. Energy is protected. There is a clearer sense of what deserves care and what does not. This selectivity is not withdrawal. It is refinement. Life becomes simpler, but richer. There is also a new intimacy with silence. Silence is no longer empty. It is full of clarity. In silence, thoughts settle, emotions organize, and intuition becomes audible. Decisions made from this place feel right without needing excessive justification. Confidence also takes on a different quality. It is not built on certainty or dominance. It is built on adaptability. Knowing that no matter what happens, you can respond without losing yourself. This confidence does not advertise itself. It is felt in posture, tone, and timing. Even ambition changes here. Goals remain, but they are no longer fueled by restlessness or comparison. Effort becomes an expression of interest rather than a reaction to inadequacy. Work feels meaningful because it aligns with values, not because it proves something. The relationship with others continues to soften and strengthen at the same time. There is less tolerance for. At this stage, emotional maturity becomes invisible. There is nothing to demonstrate. Calm is not used as a badge. It is simply present. People may notice it indirectly, in how conflicts resolve quickly or how tension seems to dissipate around you. Ultimately, never getting angry reveals itself as a misunderstanding. Anger was never the problem. The problem was dependence on it. Once that dependence dissolves, anger loses relevance. It may appear briefly, but it does not stay. What remains is a stable, responsive inner life that does not need emotional extremes to feel real. Life feels lived rather than managed, experienced rather than defended. And in this living, there is a quiet satisfaction. Not the excitement of constant achievement, but the contentment of alignment. Nothing dramatic, nothing forced, just a steady sense of being where you are, fully, without resistance. This is not an endpoint. It is a rhythm, a way of moving through time with fewer collisions inside. And once this rhythm is established, it carries forward naturally, without effort, into whatever comes next. By now, the journey has moved beyond techniques, beyond understanding, even beyond effort. What remains is a way of inhabiting life that feels settled. Not static, not rigid, but quietly grounded. Anger no longer defines the emotional landscape, and because of that, something deeper has taken its place, ease with reality as it is. This ease does not mean life is always pleasant. Difficulty still arises, loss still hurts, uncertainty still visits. The difference is that none of these experiences threaten the inner center anymore. They arrive, they are felt, and they move through without demanding a fight. The impulse to resist has softened into the capacity to allow. At this depth, awareness is continuous rather than reactive. You notice your internal state the way you notice the weather. Not with judgment, not with urgency, but with clarity. This awareness prevents emotions from building unnoticed. Nothing needs to explode because nothing is being ignored. There is also a mature understanding that not every feeling needs expression. Expression is no longer confused with honesty. Some emotions are meant to be felt privately, processed quietly, and released gently. This discernment prevents unnecessary damage while preserving authenticity. One of the most freeing realizations here is that peace does not depend on resolution. Questions can remain unanswered. Situations can remain imperfect. Relationships can remain unfinished. And still, there is calm. This freedom from needing closure reduces anxiety and opens space for patience. Life also feels less personal in a healthy way. Events are no longer filtered through the lens of ego. Praise does not inflate. Criticism does not wound deeply. Other people's behavior is understood as a reflection of their inner world rather than a verdict on your worth. This perspective protects dignity without isolating you. At this stage, responsibility is carried lightly. You do what is yours to do, and you leave the rest where it belongs. There is no urge to fix everyone or correct everything. Effort becomes precise rather than excessive. This precision conserves energy and increases effectiveness. There is also a deep respect for timing. You sense when to speak and when to wait, when to act and when to step back. This sensitivity comes from listening inwardly rather than reacting outwardly. Decisions made this way tend to feel right even when they are difficult. Another subtle shift is the absence of inner rehearsal. The mind no longer practices arguments or revisits past conflicts. This frees attention for creativity, presence, and rest. Mental space opens, and with it, a quieter joy. Joy here is not excitement. It is contentment, a steady appreciation of being alive without needing constant stimulation. Simple moments carry weight. Ordinary days feel sufficient. This is not boredom. It is peace without drama. The longer this way of being continues, the more it becomes self-reinforcing. Calm leads to better choices. Better choices lead to better outcomes. Better outcomes strengthen trust. Trust deepens calm. The cycle feeds itself gently. Eventually, the idea of anger as an identity or habit feels distant, almost foreign. It is remembered, but not missed. There is no nostalgia for emotional chaos. What once felt powerful now feels heavy. And so, the path resolves itself not in a dramatic transformation, but in a quiet return to something natural. A state of presence that was always available, obscured only by resistance and reactivity. Living without anger does not mean living without fire. It means the fire is contained, purposeful, and warm rather than destructive. It fuels clarity, courage. Nothing needs to be added. Nothing needs to be fought. The work is done, and at the same time, it continues effortlessly in each moment that follows. What remains now is not a lesson, but a lived atmosphere. The kind that doesn't call attention to itself, yet shapes everything within it. Life unfolds in this atmosphere with less friction, less inner resistance, and far less emotional noise. Nothing dramatic has changed on the outside, and yet almost everything feels different on the inside. At this point, awareness has become intimate. You notice subtle shifts in mood before they harden into reactions. A trace of irritation, a hint of defensiveness, a moment of tension in the body. These signals are no longer ignored or feared. They are acknowledged gently and allowed to dissolve. This early noticing is what prevents anger from ever needing to rise fully. There is also a growing trust in the natural intelligence of emotion. Feelings are no longer seen as problems to solve, but as movements to observe. Each one carries information, not instruction. When listened to without urgency, emotions complete themselves. Nothing needs to be forced out or pushed away. This changes the relationship with discomfort. Discomfort is no longer an enemy. It is simply part of the landscape. You can be uncomfortable and still be okay. This understanding removes the reflex to escape, attack, or defend. Endurance becomes effortless when resistance is absent. Another quiet change is the disappearance of inner urgency. The sense that something must be fixed immediately fades. Life is allowed to breathe. This does not lead to neglect. It leads to rhythm. Actions happen at the right time instead of the rushed time. There is also a deeper respect for boundaries, both yours and others. Without anger pushing against limits, boundaries are felt rather than enforced. You sense when something is too much, and you step back without resentment. You sense when engagement is appropriate, and you move forward without force. The emotional tone of memory changes as well. Past events lose their charge. They are remembered as facts, not wounds. Even painful memories soften when they are no longer reinforced by repeated emotional reactions. This creates a feeling of psychological lightness, as if carrying less invisible weight. At this stage, presence becomes the default. You are where you are, doing what you are doing, without constant mental commentary. This presence brings a quiet satisfaction. Not excitement, not pleasure chasing, but a grounded sense of enoughness. Interpersonal dynamics continue to simplify. You no longer feel compelled to explain yourself excessively or defend your choices. Clarity replaces justification. This often leads to fewer misunderstandings, and when misunderstandings occur, they resolve more cleanly. There is also a natural gravitation toward honesty. Without anger distorting communication, truth feels safer to express. Not blunt truth, but considered truth. Words are chosen to reflect reality rather than to protect ego. The absence of anger also allows deeper listening. You hear not just words, but tone, hesitation, and intent. This listening changes the quality of connection. People feel met rather than managed. Over time, life begins to feel less like a series of problems to solve and more like a process to participate in. Effort is still required, but struggle is optional. This distinction changes everything. Eventually, the idea of never getting angry dissolves completely. There is no rule being followed, no achievement being maintained. There is simply an inner environment in which anger rarely makes sense. What takes its place is not emotional neutrality, but emotional harmony. Feelings arise, interact, and settle without dominating. The inner world becomes more like a flowing system than a battlefield. And in this harmony, something deeply human emerges. A quiet compassion for yourself, for others, and for the unpredictable nature of life itself. Not a dramatic compassion, but a steady one. This is where the journey rests. Not in stillness, but in flow. Not in control, but in alignment. Life continues, but it is no longer something to be fought internally. Nothing is concluded. At this final stretch, the transformation no longer feels like a process at all. It feels like home. Not because everything is perfect, but because there is no longer a sense of being at odds with life. The inner resistance that once demanded constant management has softened into acceptance, and acceptance has matured into quiet confidence. What stands out most now is how little emotional effort is required to live well. You do not need to remind yourself to stay calm. Calm is simply there. You do not need to restrain anger. It rarely gathers enough momentum to matter. Emotional balance has become a background condition, like gravity, steady and reliable. This stability allows deeper engagement with life rather than withdrawal from it. You can step into difficult conversations without bracing yourself. You can face disappointment without collapsing inward. You can encounter conflict without losing clarity. Strength is no longer measured by how forcefully you react, but by how fully you remain present. There is also a sense of emotional dignity that emerges. You no longer feel exposed or raw in the face of challenge. At the same time, you are not closed or distant. You feel intact, whole. This wholeness makes it possible to be open without being destabilized. The mind, freed from emotional turbulence, becomes more spacious. Creativity increases. Insight comes more easily. You begin to notice patterns in life without effort. Cause and effect become clearer. Choices feel more intuitive because they are not filtered through fear or frustration. Relationships continue to reflect this inner change. You attract fewer chaotic dynamics, not because you avoid people, but because you no longer resonate with unnecessary drama. Interactions feel cleaner. Expectations are clearer. Respect becomes mutual rather than demanded. There is also a deepened sense of responsibility that feels empowering rather than heavy. You understand what is within your control and what is not. You act where you can make a difference and release what you cannot. This discernment prevents burnout and preserves energy. Time feels less adversarial. There is no constant sense of being behind or running out. You do what can be done today and trust tomorrow to arrive. This trust reduces anxiety and allows presence to expand. At this point, emotional intelligence is no longer something you practice. It is something you embody. Others may sense it without being able to name it. They feel safer, calmer, more grounded in your presence. Not because you manage them, but because you are not managing yourself. One of the most meaningful shifts here is the end of self-conflict. You are no longer fighting your emotions, your past, or your personality. You understand yourself well enough to move with your nature rather than against it. This cooperation creates inner peace that does not depend on circumstances. The idea of anger now feels almost outdated. Not forbidden, not suppressed, simply unnecessary. Life offers enough information without it. Clarity arrives without force. Action follows understanding, not emotional pressure. There is a quiet gratitude that accompanies this stage. Not gratitude for specific outcomes, but for the ability to meet whatever comes with steadiness. This gratitude is subtle, but it runs deep. In the end, never getting angry reveals itself not as an achievement, but as a side effect of understanding. When you understand yourself, others, and the nature of experience deeply enough, anger loses its purpose. What remains is a calm, alert engagement with life, a readiness without tension, a strength without hardness, a peace that does not need protection. And with that, the journey does not conclude. By now, there is nothing left to strive for emotionally. The effort that once went into self-control, understanding, and restraint has dissolved into something quieter and more natural. Life is no longer approached as a problem to be solved internally. It is experienced directly, moment by moment, without the constant need to adjust or defend. At this stage, the inner world feels trustworthy. You are not on guard against yourself anymore. Thoughts come and go. Emotions rise and fall. None of them feel dangerous. This trust removes the final layer of tension that many people carry without realizing it. The body relaxes into its own rhythm. The mind follows. What becomes especially clear now is how unnecessary struggle once was. Not because challenges were imagined, but because resistance amplified them. Without that resistance, even difficult experiences feel cleaner. Pain still exists, but it does not multiply itself through mental conflict. There is no added story of injustice, no internal argument with reality. There is also a new intimacy with stillness. Stillness is no longer something you seek in order to recover. It is present even in movement. You can be busy and still be calm, engaged and still be grounded. This is a different kind of peace, one that travels with you rather than requiring special conditions. The way you relate to thought has also changed. Thoughts are no longer believed automatically. They are seen as mental events, not commands. This creates freedom. A thought can arise without needing to be followed. This alone dissolves countless emotional reactions before they form. Identity continues to soften. You are less invested in how you are perceived and more rooted in how you live. Approval loses its urgency. Disapproval loses its sting. You remain open, but not dependent. This independence is not isolation. It is self-sufficiency. With this self-sufficiency comes a deeper compassion for others. You no longer need them to behave a certain way for you to feel stable. Their moods, opinions, and reactions no longer dictate your inner state. This makes it easier to be patient, to listen, and to respond with care rather than defense. Life also feels less fragmented. There is a sense of continuity between moments. You are not one person at work and another at rest, one version under stress and another in calm. The same presence moves through all situations. This integration reduces exhaustion and increases authenticity. The absence of anger at this level is almost invisible. It does not feel like an absence at all. It feels like spaciousness. Room to think, room to feel, room to choose. Emotional life becomes flexible rather than rigid. At this depth, even strong emotions like passion or grief are experienced without being destabilizing. They move through fully and honestly, without leaving residue. You are not afraid of intensity because you trust your capacity to remain present within it. The longer this way of being continues, the more obvious it becomes that anger was never the source of strength or clarity. It was a substitute. Once awareness, understanding, and alignment took its place, the substitute was no longer needed. There is a gentle confidence now that does not rely on comparison or achievement. It rests in the simple fact of being able to meet life as it comes. This confidence does not seek attention. It does not need reinforcement. As days pass, this calm becomes ordinary, and that ordinariness is the true mark of completion. When peace no longer feels special, but natural, it has been fully integrated. From here, life continues without inner commentary about progress or failure. There is no sense of being on a path. There is just living, responding, participating. And in that participation, the idea of anger fades completely into the background. Not avoided, not denied. What follows now is a kind of quiet maturity that does not announce itself. It shows up in how little explanation is needed, how few internal negotiations take place, how naturally life is met without preparation. The inner system has learned what it needs to know. There is no longer a sense of practicing calm or maintaining balance. Balance maintains itself. At this point, reactions feel almost impersonal. When something unexpected happens, there is awareness before interpretation, sensation before story. This order matters. It prevents emotion from crystallizing into identity. You feel what you feel, but it does not become who you are. This separation is not detachment. It is clarity. There is also a deep comfort with emotional range. You no longer seek to stay in pleasant states or avoid difficult ones. Both are allowed. Joy does not create clinging. Discomfort does not create panic. Experience is trusted to move on its own. This trust eliminates the last traces of inner control. One of the clearest signs of this stage is how naturally you return to center. Even after a challenging interaction or an emotionally charged event, equilibrium reappears without effort. There is no need to analyze what happened or replay conversations. The system self-corrects. Calm is no longer fragile. The mind, now free from constant emotional monitoring, becomes more precise. Attention sharpens. You notice details you once missed. You listen more fully. You respond more accurately. This precision improves every area of life, from relationships to work to decision-making. There is also a new kind of patience that feels expansive rather than restrained. Waiting does not feel like delay. It feels like allowing. You understand that forcing outcomes often creates resistance, while timing creates flow. This understanding changes how you engage with goals and obstacles alike. Interpersonal tension continues to lose its grip. When conflict arises, it is addressed directly or released without residue. There is no emotional echo afterward, no lingering irritation, no sense of unfinished business. Closure happens naturally when emotion is not clung to. At this level, self-respect is steady and internal. You do not need others to validate your reactions or understand your choices. You know when you have acted with integrity. That knowledge is enough. This removes the subtle anxiety that comes from constantly gauging external response. There is also a noticeable decline in mental noise. Thoughts still arise, but they are fewer and softer. Silence is no longer interrupted by constant commentary. This quiet allows intuition to surface more clearly. Decisions feel guided rather than calculated. Life begins to feel surprisingly simple. Not easy, but simple. You do what needs to be done. You rest when rest is needed. You speak when it is useful. You remain silent when it is not. There is less drama around these choices because there is less internal conflict driving them. Anger, at this stage, feels almost theoretical. You remember what it was like, but it no longer fits your current experience. It does not match the clarity you now operate from. It would feel inefficient, even unnatural, to return to it. This does not mean you have become passive or disengaged. On the contrary, engagement is deeper because it is not clouded by reaction. You are fully present in challenges without being consumed by them. This presence is felt by others, often without words. There is also a gentle humor that begins to appear. Not sarcasm or dismissal, but an understanding of the human condition. Mistakes, misunderstandings, and imperfections are seen with perspective. Life feels less heavy when it is not taken personally. As this way of being continues, it requires no maintenance. It does not degrade under stress. It does not disappear under pressure. It has become structural, not emotional. Part of how you function, not something you perform. And so, the journey reaches a point where there is nothing left to describe in terms of change. What remains is consistency. A steady, grounded way of meeting life without resistance or aggression. Anger no longer needs to be avoided, controlled, or transformed. It has simply been rendered unnecessary by understanding. From here on, life unfolds as it always has, with At this point, the journey has thinned down to something very simple. There is no technique left to apply, no mindset to maintain, no emotional rule to follow. What remains is a quiet readiness for life as it actually is. Not as it should be, not as it was hoped to be, but as it appears in each moment. This readiness is not effortful. It is relaxed and alert at the same time. You begin to notice that even when situations are intense, the inner response is proportionate. There is no excess, no emotional spillover. A problem is just a problem. A loss is just a loss. Pain is allowed to be painful without being amplified by inner protest. This proportionality is one of the clearest signs that anger has truly lost its grip. At this depth, emotional reactions no longer define character. You may still feel irritation, disappointment, or sadness, but these experiences pass through without reshaping identity. You do not think of yourself as someone who gets angry, or someone who must stay calm. You are simply someone who responds. Identity has loosened enough to allow flexibility. There is also a strong sense of internal fairness. You are no longer harsh with yourself for feeling something, nor indulgent in acting it out. Emotions are treated with respect, but not authority. This balanced relationship prevents both suppression and explosion. It is a middle way that feels natural rather than managed. The body reflects this change. There is less chronic tension. Breathing is easier. Rest feels deeper. Stress still occurs, but it no longer accumulates in the same way. Recovery happens faster because the nervous system is no longer repeatedly pushed into fight mode. You may also notice that your attention has shifted outward in a healthier way. Instead of being preoccupied with internal states, you are more engaged with what you are doing, who you are with, and what is actually happening. Presence becomes practical. Life is lived forward, not inward. There is a quiet confidence in handling disagreement now. You can hear opposing views without bracing. You can disagree without hostility. You can stand firm without tightening. This changes the texture of conversations. Even when resolution is not possible, respect often is. Another subtle marker of this stage is how little explanation feels necessary. You do not feel compelled to justify your calm or explain your choices. You act, and you let the action stand. This simplicity reduces friction and preserves energy. Anger, when it briefly appears, is almost informative rather than consuming. It signals that something matters or that a boundary exists. Once the information is received, the emotion fades. There is no attachment to it, no sense of righteousness or momentum. It does not linger. Life now feels less like something to endure and more like something to participate in. Even difficulty feels participatory rather than adversarial. You work with circumstances instead of against them internally. This cooperation with reality changes the quality of effort. It feels cleaner, more effective. There is also an acceptance of human imperfection that runs deep. Yours and others. Mistakes no longer require emotional punishment. Learning replaces judgment. Adjustment replaces blame. This makes growth sustainable instead of exhausting. At this stage, calm is not fragile. It does not shatter under pressure. It bends, absorbs, and returns. This resilience is not built on avoidance, but on understanding. Understanding how emotions work. Understanding how the mind amplifies suffering. Understanding when to act and when to let go. Eventually, the phrase, "never get angry," loses meaning altogether. Not because anger is forbidden, but because it is no longer central. It is not the lens through which life is viewed. It is a minor note in a much larger emotional range. What truly remains is alignment. Thoughts, feelings, and actions move in the same direction more often than not. This alignment creates a sense of ease that does not depend on circumstances being favorable. Even in difficulty, there is coherence. And so, without fanfare, the journey settles into ordinary life. Work, relationships, challenges, quiet moments. Nothing extraordinary on the surface. Yet internally, there is a steady ground that was once missing. Anger did not need to be defeated. It needed to be understood until it became unnecessary. From here, life continues as it always has, but you continue differently. Calm not as a strategy, but as a state. Strength not as force, but as steadiness. And that steadiness remains, carrying you forward, without effort, into whatever comes next.